No, no, completely fine. Awesome. Okay. Um, yeah, again, just great to be here with you all. Thank you again, Israel, for the invitation. It's very kind of you. As Israel and I have discussed over a couple of uh, fortunate meetings. So this is work that I kind of started when I was in India and 3, 4 years ago, when the topic of sort of national climate legislation was an active question in the country at that time. And so I produced a report for a think tank based out of Delhi that did not take a strong position one way or the other on whether India should have a framework climate law, but just sort of laid out what were the possibilities that this kind of law could deliver on for India. And as part of that, of course, I got exposed to the sheer range of climate legislation around the world. I mean, you already always have a general idea that, okay, many different countries are working on this sort of thing. Many different people are interested in this area, but the sheer amount of work going on in this area was a pleasant surprise to me. And I started thinking about, okay, what is it about the structure of these laws that ties them to the objectives that they're trying to achieve? What are these framework climate laws trying to do? So and I wanted to broaden my investigation beyond India. After that, I joined the PhD program at the Fletcher School, and this offered me an opportunity, along with the Climate Policy Lab, which is where I work, to kind of broaden my scope of inquiry and start asking broader questions about the structure of climate laws, not specific to one country. Although, of course, that brings its own challenges, as I'm sure we will discuss. But so I started asking, are climate laws effective, and what are the features of effective climate laws? My particular focus is on framework climate legislation. So these are economy-wide laws enacted by a national legislature, often referred to as a parliament, but not always, whose explicit central focus is addressing climate change. So there's a range of climate relevant laws, for example, an energy sector law or a motor vehicles law that are climate relevant, but I'm focusing on laws very often that almost have climate in their title. So at the time that I started this research, well, as of 2024, more than 40 jurisdictions have enacted such framework climate legislation, including countries from across major world regions and levels of economic development, and they collectively account for a decent chunk of global greenhouse emissions, about 20%. So the reason I'm interested also particularly in these laws, I mean, apart from my sort of history, I have a background, an undergraduate degree in law. I'm interested in governance and institutional formation. So these kinds of laws are more likely to show evidence of new institutional formation, new types of institutions, new types of governance. So what I did was I coded the text of selected climate laws based on types of institutions, as well as the links between institutions that are written into the text of the legislation themselves. I then reviewed, so that sort of gave me a picture of what I see as the quality of the law as drafted. Although this is one particular view of the quality of the law, there are other ways to measure, okay, what you think is a good law or a bad law, but this is my measure. Secondly, I reviewed literature on national experiences with climate policy making. And when I sort of combined A and B, I was able to build a sense of, okay, whether uh, in my opinion, well-drafted laws were producing better or worse climate policy making outcomes. And I'll come back to the conclusion in the end. The framework that I was using, just I'll try to move this bar out of my own way. Right. The framework I was using is a very simple framework. This is a way of categorizing institutions. This is a paper published in 1986 called, and it's often referred to as the Tools of Government paper. And it basically says there are 4 types of tools of government. A government can exercise authority, it can serve as a node, it can commit treasure, which is basically finance, funding, or it can serve as an organizing force in society. And so then I sort of translated these 4 tools of government into broad types of institutions, which in my telling are regulatory, informational, which is scientific, technical, or policy advisory institutions, financial institutions, and coordination institutions. So what I'm trying to do, just to stay on this slide for a second, what I'm trying to do here is to just say that, okay, these are the basic types of institutions that I think laws, framework climate laws should cover. That if one particular type of institution is missing, then that's probably a bad thing for the impact that the law is able to make on national climate policy making. That's the broad idea here. And so I'm not particularly interested in very detailed subtypes of institutions. I'm interested in, okay, are you at least covering your broad bases? These are the things, at least, that a law should be bringing to the problem of governing climate change or regulating greenhouse emissions. The countries I chose were basically to cover different political systems, different legal traditions, different regions of the world, different levels of development, and all of them at least have a sort of non-minimal share of global greenhouse emissions. So based on this, I chose 8 countries, which is the United Kingdom, Philippines, Mexico, Kenya, Pakistan, Germany, Canada, and South Korea. And all of these countries have this specific type of law, which is a framework climate law. And Mexico, without my anticipating, it turns out to be a particularly interesting example for my analysis, although we'll come to why that is later. So this is just a slide to illustrate how I'm coding. I used the qualitative coding software to sort of go through the text of the law section by section and say, okay, well, this particular section or subsection is creating a regulatory institution or a coordinating institution, so on and so forth. The way I'm defining these not the definition, so the kinds of institutions that I'm finding in these laws. So for example, in regulatory institutions, these are institutions which create obligations on the government or on private entities, or text that empowers the government to create obligations on private entities. So these include, in the various texts of the law that I'm going through, emissions reductions targets, or they could include specified obligations other than emissions reductions targets, such as a mandate to set periodic targets. So even though you're not specifying the trajectory, you're saying you have to set a periodic trajectory, or you set up an emissions reporting standard. So that's not you're not saying you must reach a level of emissions, but you're saying you have to report on your emissions, and you combine those with penalties. So that I also code as a regulatory institution. They also, in this categorization, include more unspecified or somewhat generic obligations, which include the provisions include provisions mandating the mainstreaming of climate priorities into broader policy making. So examples of this include a due consideration requirement in Germany and in the German climate law, and a mandatory climate risk and vulnerability assessment requirement in the Kenyan framework law. So these are just some what I found of in terms of target setting provisions in these framework climate laws. The broad takeaway from here is that some of the laws set quantified explicit targets in the text of the law, and some of them don't. So this is not a universal feature of these framework laws. And also, for the purpose of my analysis, I'm not using this as kind of the gold standard of what constitutes a good or a bad law. I think there's a broader definition of what emissions regulation can mean than simply setting a quantified target. A coordination institution is a non-legally binding climate action strategy or plan. So, for example, the greenhouse gas emissions plan in Canada, or a national strategy program in Mexico, and there are a couple of other candidates as well as in the Mexican law. But these are basically either a requirement to set a plan or a plan specified in the law, but the plan itself is not legally binding. So it's sort of a policy target, but not a legally binding one. Or it can be a body created or empowered to prepare such a strategy or plan. So this would generally include the head of the executive branch, as well as cabinet-level ministers such as the Minister of Finance or Environment, and key sectors such as energy, transport, or industry. In some cases, it includes members representing civil society, the private sector, particular regions, or specific expertise. So example, these are very common across these laws. Examples include the National Climate Change Council in Kenya or in Pakistan, the Climate Change Commission in the Philippines, an institution called the 2050 Carbon Neutrality and Green Growth Committee in South Korea, and multiple such coordination institutions specified in the Mexican Climate Framework Law. Scientific or technical advisory institutions are a specific kind of institutions. So this is either new scientific or technical advisory institutions or similar functions assigned to existing institutions. Generally, the legislation itself specifies the mix of expertise required. So very often they'll specify that this advisory body has to have climate scientists or people with knowledge of economic and social sciences. And in some cases, it also specifies that they have to be representatives of particular expertise, such as indigenous people and knowledge. So examples of these include, say, famously, the United Kingdom's Committee on Climate Change, the Council of Experts on Climate Change in Germany, the National Institute of Ecology and Climate Change in Mexico, and a couple of others that I've laid out there. Financial institutions, again, take a couple of different forms. They can include dedicated climate funds, but they can also include budgeting rules, which direct government expenditure towards climate priorities, and rules governing voluntary carbon markets. So the distinction that I'm making here in terms of the third is between voluntary and mandatory carbon markets. Voluntary carbon markets I see as a financial institution, whereas mandatory carbon markets, which are linked to national targets, are coded as regulatory institutions. So examples of these are Philippines legislation, for example, specifying that all government agencies are required to allocate funds from their annual appropriations, towards framing and achieving climate action plans. And the national government is required, again, in the text of the legislation, to extend technical and financial assistance for the accomplishment of local climate change action plans. So that's a budgeting requirement. Kenya's legislation creates a climate change fund. Mexico's legislation similarly creates a climate change fund, although obviously the experience with that fund is mixed, as we know. Here, it's worth, I think, highlighting a particular legislation, which is South Korea's, which creates, again, surprisingly to me, the most detailed set of financial institutions for any of the legislations that I reviewed. So national and local governments are supposed to tag their own budgets for climate expenditure, as well as analyze the impacts of their expenditure on climate change. So it mandates the governments to tax greenhouse emissions and energy efficiency, but the proceed and then provide financial supports or incentives to address climate change, mandates the government to assist green industries in accessing international foreign investment, similarly creates a climate change response fund, and then specifies the sources of finance, including 7% of annual traffic, energy, and environment taxes, deposits from the Public Capital Management Fund, and revenues from carbon trading or permit allocation. So it's and finally, again, uniquely to any legislation I've seen, it also requires that the Climate Response Fund, that the National Climate Response Fund should support international cooperation on the climate crisis. So it's like an international climate finance mandate, which is I don't think any law generally tells a government that it's required to spend money outside its own borders on a climate priority. So it was unique to me. So anyway, the broad picture that emerges from all of this is that there are certain types of institutions are underrepresented in general and underrepresented in particular countries. So across all countries, or across the 8 legislations that I reviewed, there was an underrepresentation of financial institutions in these laws. So for example, across all laws, 40% of the text of the law dealt with coordination institutions, 25% of the text of all the laws dealt with regulatory institutions, 22% scientific or technical institutions. Only 9% of them dealt with financial institutions. And as climate change becomes, one would say, maybe less of a regulatory and a little bit more of an investment problem, one would expect that this probably needs to change. Then when we go on a kind of law to law or country to country basis, it's noteworthy that the UK law, which is reputed to be a fairly strong law, has, apart from very few financial institutions, it also creates virtually no coordination institutions. It's very heavily focused on regulatory and scientific advisory institutions. Similarly, for example, not similarly, in a sort of mirror image, Philippines and Pakistan have a lot of coordination institutions and very, very few provisions in the law that are regulatory in nature. By my finding, 2% and 6% of the text in those legislations are regulatory in nature. So I'll come back to those missing pieces later. In terms of the links between the institutions, these are language in the law that require institutions to respond to each other's mandates or act on each other's work. So where I found that the link was sort of in one direction, that only one institution was required to respond to the other institution's work, such as, for example, a regulatory institution was, an advisory institution was required to advise a regulator. That's a one-way link. But if an advisory institution is required to advise a regulator, and on the other hand, the regulator is required to act on that advice by the scientific or technical institution, to my mind, that's a two-way link and a much stronger link. So I was looking for pieces of text in the legislation that sort of require institutions to interact and respond to each other's mandates. And this is what I found, which is that, for example, in the United Kingdom, you have this two-way link between the regulator and the advisory body, where there's a mandate to advise and evaluate progress from the advisory body to the regulator. But also the regulator has a duty in the text of the law to respond to advice and the evaluations of the advisory body. And if they set targets that are sort of contradictory to the advice of the Climate Change Committee, which is the technical scientific body, then they're required to explain why the regulation or the policy differs from the advice. There are similarly strong links in all the laws, but the content of those links differs, and the kinds of institutions that are linked between those laws by those laws differ. So, for example, in Philippines, there's a requirement to the National Climate Fund to financially support local governments' climate programs. In Mexico, there are a number of what I read as fairly strong links. There's a mandate to evaluate progress, a duty to integrate advice into future planning, a duty to fund priorities set by the National Climate Plan. So again, there are these links between institutions in the text of the law, but there's different laws creates different levels of strong linkage. I now come to and I hope I'm doing okay on time, but I come to the second part of my analysis, which is, okay, I review the national experience with policy making. For this, I basically did a literature review of other people's writing on the effect of these laws domestically in these 8 countries, and the broad state of climate policy making in the country after the enactment of the laws. So what I find, I try to relate to the institutional mix that I found in the laws of those countries. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, there is analysis that says there is weak coordination among bureaucratic institutions and weak integration of climate policy across government departments. which has contributed to a combination of ambitious targets and inconsistent implementation. And that phenomenon is referred to by the literature as hot air and cold feet. So despite the climate policy making in the United Kingdom having many strong points, especially in the regulatory department, the fact that the bureaucracy is not able to coordinate adequately is still felt as a weakness, and that lines up to an extent with the fact that the law itself does not create many coordinating institutions. The UK law is heavy on regulatory and the scientific and technical advice. It doesn't create a lot of coordinating institutions. In the Philippines, it's felt that the Climate Change Commission's mandate overlaps with other agencies, but it has limited regulatory authority to hold other agencies accountable, and there is limited provision for independent technical advice. So again, this lines up with the fact that in the Philippines law is heavily focused on coordinating institutions. It doesn't have a lot of regulatory institutions, and it doesn't have a lot of independent scientific technical advisory institutions. Pakistan, similarly, quoting from national assessments, the law lacks regulatory grid. The authority and fund are yet to be constituted, although the Supreme Court has instructed the government to do so. Again, similarly, because the law does not actually create any regulatory institutions, so legal enforcement of the law is difficult. In South Korea, a lot of coordination institutions, decent number of financial institutions, and some amount of regulatory institutions, but very few institutions for independent scientific and technical advice. So here, the national assessment found that centralized committee-led policymaking created complex administrative procedures, an insufficient budget, and poor execution. Bureaucrats and government-selected experts lack independence. Citizen participation and government-funded research are limited to legitimizing government or bureaucratic preferences. In Germany, 20% was cut from the Climate and Transformation Fund. Climate targets are no longer binding on sectoral line ministries, which lines up with the fact that in Germany, the law itself does not prescribe any financial institutions. So the fund that they're talking about here is not a fund created by law. It's a fund that is created by government policy, but is not embedded in the framework law. So again, a sort of missing institution leads to a gap in national climate policy making. In Mexico, the observation is that there are gaps between the text of the law and the reality of climate policy arrangements, processes, and practices. There are unclear mandates and limited coordination. Excuse me. Key bodies have not held meetings and do not prioritize doing so. Now, this is just in light of the law. It's not clear to me. Well, it is clear to me. I mean, in many ways, it's the law not being followed is not an unknown possibility. But in light of the fact that the law itself specifies the kinds of institutions that it creates and sort of fairly lays out the mandates of those institutions, the fact that hasn't translated into improvements in national policy making is a finding that sort of cuts against the theory that I come into this paper with, that if the law itself is reasonably well specified, then it should have policy and enough coverage of different institutions, it should have positive effects on national policy making. So this is something that I come back to in my later findings, but it is something that cuts against the theory here that a well-designed law, and Mexico's, in my opinion, just from the parameters that I have selected, appeared to be a well-designed law. The fact that well-designed law, again, based on my parameters, hasn't translated into policy outcomes is something that cuts against the theory here. Right. I'll come back to these. Actually, sorry. Moving to the effects of missing links. So these are countries in which, the links between institutions are less well specified. So, for example, in Philippines, the law creates a lot of coordination institutions and it prioritizes local climate action, but it does not. There's not a lot of text in the laws specifying how institutions should interact with each other. So that has resulted in a fragmentation or misalignment of policy between sectors and between the climate change action plan and the national development plan, because the law itself does not quite specify how the climate change action plan should relate to the national development plan. Again, the law creates this advisory institution, which is the Climate Change Commission, but does not specify its mandate in any great detail, and its mandate overlaps with other agencies without specifying how it is supposed to interact with those agencies. So the CC, despite the fact that there is this Climate Change Commission, it is not a particularly effective body, including because it has this very limited local presence that makes it difficult to engage with local governments.
Tarun, sorry, is it okay if you kind of give a closure in a couple of minutes so we can have enough time for further discussion afterwards?
Yeah, sounds. I think I'll just a couple more slides and then
I have already seen the paper, so most of the people here read it. So
okay, great.
Don't worry.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay. Yeah, just to briefly touch on. Okay, again, this point that I would like sort of feedback on. In Mexico's law, when I came across this Article 70, I thought, okay, this is an article that I'm going to code as a link between the financial institution and the planning or the coordination institutions, because it says that it seems to say that on first reading, it seemed to say that all the priorities and the plans outlined in the law should be funded by the government. And then I read it more closely, or at least I read the translation that I could find more closely. And it seems to basically make the implementation of all the climate priorities and the plans outlined in the law, in a sense, contingent on the availability of the budget resources. So if there is a budget available, these priorities will be carried out, rather than requiring the budget to account for climate priorities. So this then seemed to me like something that sort of weakened the whole structure of the law and enabled the government to say, well, we only need to address those priorities if there are resources left over from other priorities being addressed. And I had a little bit of conversation with Israel about this, and he gave me, I think, some very useful context about why the law may have been written that way and what these kinds of laws are trying to do. But I would love to hear from, excuse me, I would love to hear from all of you about that point. Excuse me, I'm just dealing with a little cough.
Don't worry. I'm also almost dying, Tarun. Jorge, sí, ahorita te comentas tú unos, ¿qué? Minutos y ya arrancamos la discusión todos, ¿les parece bien?
Ok.
O no sé si tienes algo preparado. ¿Sí? Dime, profe.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think maybe I'll just wrap up on my takeaways and then move to discussion. Sorry, I've been down for a couple of days with this cough, and I was hoping I could just push through it, but it's caught up with me a little bit. Apologies.
Don't worry, Tarun. It's normal, and thank you so much for for your work.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. So just to summarize, basic takeaways, there is an effect of missing institutional types in the text of framework climate legislation, which is visible in national climate policy making experience. Similarly, with weak or one-sided links between institutions. Um, However, even laws that cover major institutional types and specify strong interaction between institutions can struggle to hold up to determined political opposition. And in many of these countries, there is opposition to climate policy making. Some of the follow-up work that I have in my own head for this work is there's climate litigation. This paper is not focused on litigation, but I was curious about whether litigation in these countries is kind of using what is available in these laws or whether it's not able to do so. And then finally, just a caveat is that there are many important details which are strongly related to, but the scope of this paper, but that I didn't address simply to kind of clarify the scope, which are institutions created by other kinds of laws, which is non-framework laws, adaptation-focused laws. I focused here on mitigation. Rules or guidelines made under the authority of framework climate legislation. Here I've just focused on the broad law and the role of informal institutions. So with that, again, thank you very much for your time, and I would love to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Tarun, and also for your courage of presenting even when you're having this cough. I know you had a hard winter in Cambridge, so we fully understand. So please now I will give you the word to Jorge for some comments that in order to initiate with the conversation. Jorge, please.
thank you, Israel. Well, to start, thank you so much for the invitation to comment on this important text for us, uh, of us studying climate policy. And after read it, I truly believe it is a relevant contribution and it succeeds in systemizing and organizing a strong body of literature on climate change legislation and worldwide. So I made some brief notes that I'd like to share based on my reading of the document. And first off, I really appreciate the use of qualitative approach in the research design, especially given the current wave in which quantitative methods insist to having a greater validity. I also think it's valuable that the text address a phenomenon unfolding right before our eyes, the classic dilemma in public policy about what happens between design and evaluation. To put it clearly, in a relation on a basic public policy literature, we're seeing how the actors involved or affected by climate change are using decision notes or implementation links to pool resources and interest in order to achieve results, whatever they may be. In fact, it's curious that the concept of the link is used later, the text when it's been repeatedly said in implementation is precisely the missing link in policy science theory. And also, while the question about the type of institution contained in the climate change legislation takes up a large part of the document, I found the second question about what makes them effective extremely pertinent. From the outset, Tarun offers a framework to answer this, suggesting that the institutions are adaptive and in themselves tend to form an ecosystem. The argument becomes stronger as the progress of the text. In fact, mentioning the individually, they may be weak, but once they interact, they can produce solid results. Bring us back to the discussion we had in the research group and many others, such as the integration of policies or policy integration. I apologize in advancing for pausing at the next point, but when talking about Mexico, in fact, you make me really laugh when I read your surprise about the Mexican case. I think it's necessary to make a comment because once again, we presenting a very, very bad example. Tarun questions, or rather tell us that there is an enigma to solve when talking about the institutionalization, or more precisely, the lack of institutionalization of climate change policy in Mexico. He suggests very aptly that this is likely to the disinterest of politicians and the lack of resources for this matter. Honestly, that's not too far from the truth. However, it's not really an enigma. The climate leadership in Mexico present approach when the framework law was developed was nothing more than an illusion meant to legitimize other political matters. Solorio summed it up in one phrase: leader in paper, regard in practice. The anti-link, the cost that haunts collaborative governance, for better or for worse, is leadership and political will. So thank you again for your presentation and your text. And thank you everyone for the invitation.
Thank you, Jorge. I swear that I do not oblige Jorge to read my paper. So, Tarun, I don't want if you want to give a response, or first we pick up some other comments or questions. How do you feel?
Just a very brief, those are fantastic comments, and I've made a note of each one of them. So thank you. You're right in a sense that it should not be an enigma. Lack of leadership and is a global phenomenon in many ways. It's an enigma to me in the limited sense that you would think that once a law is enacted, even if it is a kind of a papering over the cracks, or just a way of presenting a face, that it can itself become a tool of improving governance, even if there's political opposition. To some extent, this is why we enact laws, so that you have some stability of policy direction over a long time. Policy is not legally binding. Laws should be legally binding. But of course, we know, and in some sense, this is not a surprising finding, that with enough opposition, yes, even a law is not strong enough to resist, not just a lack of leadership, but as I understand it, without being an expert on Mexico, active opposition in the last two administrations to climate priorities. So it's not just neglect; it's opposition. But thank you so much. Thank you, Jorge, for those fantastic comments.
Thank you, Tarun. I don't know, colleagues, if any one of you want to continue with this conversation. Ceci, please.
Thank
And
you.
also, if you present yourself better, since my introduction was really short.
Thank you, Tarun. I work in Chile, and I've been looking from the very beginning to the discussion and then the enactment of the Chilean climate change framework law. And we have been working with Israel and the group for a year now in trying to compare different experiences in Latin America. Therefore, your proposal is very interesting because it's a way for comparing. So in that sense, I wanted to ask you if you have, I didn't see it in the paper, so, but maybe I missed it. You will tell me. If you have looked at Climate Scanner, the initiative of the different entities for fiscalization in the world, because we had an international seminar in Chile on Monday and Tuesday, just yesterday, and the 140 something countries that joined this association of superior entities for supervision of law have a discussion that was very much in the tone of your paper, uh, saying what's the role of them if policy they cannot control because it's not binding. But once a country has a law, then I don't know the right translation, we call it Contraloría, no sé, they can go in, and then they did a way of looking at it where they show, as you show, that but for 100 and something countries, I think 50% of the countries have now different laws. Finance was a problem, governance was a problem, and well, if you have compared, at the end, my question is, have you compared your proposal with other proposals for comparing countries, for example, climate scanner, and what can you tell us about that? And then I have another question, but after.
And I'm broadly aware of Climate Scanner, but I have not used it for this analysis. So I think that's just for something for me to think about how I compare this to what Climate Scanner is trying to do. In my mind, I've tried to compare this. Well, actually, let me start with saying that I don't think there's too many analysis. Maybe I missed one or two, but I don't think there's a lot of analysis that's trying to compare a whole number of countries or laws across a huge number of countries. Compare specifically. There are papers that use data from laws across a huge number of countries to say, okay, here is the overall effect on global emissions or national emissions. And then there are papers, I mean, we're familiar with Israel's work on this area that really dive deep into one or two countries. And so this approach that I've taken here is a little bit different, which is to say, okay, across like a medium-sized number of countries, can I suggest some framework of comparison? And of course, it's my attempt there is to create something that is sufficiently generalizable, but does not necessarily serve as like a perfect predictor of how well the design of a law relates to climate policy making outcomes. But something, a theory that is, I think, in some senses, good enough. In my mind, the comparison is with the Climate Change Laws of the World project. This is LSE Columbia. And Alina Avrachenkova, who again, I know Israel at least is familiar with them. I have a feeling a couple of you would also be familiar with, has, I think, produced for the World Bank this report on the types of institutions being created by framework climate laws, and which I thought was a fantastic report, and it's a fantastic area of work. I thought my contribution to that would be in terms of this interaction between institutions. So beyond the type of institutions that also we are talking about, whether those institutions are linked to well or not. Otherwise, you just have institutions kind of operating sometimes in cooperation, sometimes at cross purposes. So that, in my mind, was the comparison.
Thank you. That I will look at that in more detail because that's very interesting. I really want to apply to our case. So I have my second question is to the case of Chile. I mean, because you were showing how when you code, you give a way to how much of the law, how many lines of the law are in each subject.
Yeah, literally, yeah.
Yeah, and so. Have you encountered any case where maybe a line, but maybe so how do you deal with number of lines versus the weight of what says in that line?
I'm guessing you're asking how can I be sure that one line is only can only carry one quote. And that's I think it's so my principle was that each section, so each numbered section of the law, I would try to quote to one. So section 10 or 11 or 18 or 24 or whatever I would try to code as one type of institution as far as possible. Failing that, at least each subsection would be coded as. So what you're referring to as a line, it's section and subsection, not literally each line, but I think the principle is similar. Despite this, yes, there are situations in which one section creates maybe an institution that is a little bit of one or a little bit of the other. The most common type, one of that type that I found was there were institutions which it was not clear if it's a coordination institution or an technical advisory institution. A lot of countries create institutions that sit somewhere between these two. And so I had to come up with a rule that said, okay, based on the composition of the institution, it is either a coordination or an advisory institution. An advisory institution is primarily composed based on expertise, some sort of scientific or economic or legal or whatever. People are selected for their expertise. In a coordination institution, they are selected as stakeholders, as representatives of particular stakeholder groups, local government, indigenous people, for example. So I completely agree that it's not. I don't think it's an easy exercise saying, okay, one line or one section will be one type of institution. I just felt that it was useful to do that whole exercise to get a sense of, okay, across the whole law, are there big missing pieces?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ceci. Does anyone wants to continue with the conversation? Because, otherwise I have some questions. Yes, Sanjavi, and Jenny, please. I should say that we also have a half India student, that's Sanjani. So she was really looking forward to meet you.
Lovely to meet you.
Thank you, Isra. Hi, I'm Anjani Punjabi and I'm from Mexico, but my parents are from India and from Belize. And I strongly recommend this paper because I truly understood how the effects of missing institution makes harder the implementation of climate policy and the creation of them. I think I truly understood that it's not only about how you were saying that a well-designed climate policy acts, and it's because it's important to check the implementation and how institutions interact between them. And that's very necessary. I think your paper is very urgent and relevant because this way we can make a constructive criticism to the nations and for a meaningful impact. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it.
Thank
you.
I don't know if I already asked you, but if you have problem if I share with Anjani your email so she can get in touch with you.
All right. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Thank you. Does anyone else, Juan, are you available or the airport is not so comfortable? Hi, Profe.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Tarun. Thank you very much for your presentation and your work in progress. I knew in this group, and I knew in climate change too, but I come from policy studies. Maybe I have some comments from my point of view. From the point of view, I was thinking if the paper have an assumption about that there are some institutional designs that work for everybody or for all countries. That was the main concern I have. Maybe because we have to consider the difference between institutional context, cultural context. Considering that the paper have some developed countries and developing countries too, that may be an important factor explaining the difference in the achievements. I think so. Another consideration is I have I have a general opinion because about climate acts, because I think they are overemphasizing the role of laws in a context where there are many instruments. I'm thinking in Colombia. We have decrees, we have compass, we have judicial decisions, we have laws before the climate laws. Well, I'm sorry. Yes, for there are a lot of noise now. So,
I think we lost you. It's not clear.
Yeah.
and
the audio.
sorry, and the last is from a policy point of view. The instruments, yeah, we consider that institutional instruments, but now we speak about policy mixes, policy portfolios, where there are many instruments. Law is one of them, but not the only one. I don't know if you have thought about these concerns. I can explain now, but I have to take my flight. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Those are all, I think, great notes. I don't know whether are you able to stay with us for a response, or I made a note of all those notes, and I can, but Israel maybe.
Yeah, I think he's listening, but probably
Okay.
yeah, probably you can we will record the session, so you can respond, and he will also
Yeah,
be.
that makes sense. No, all great points, I think, starting with institutional strength being a very context-dependent exercise. I completely agree, which is why I did not want to take a framework that said, okay, here is uh, there are other definitions of institutional strength, and many of them emphasize the importance of regulation, basically strong regulation, strong enforcement, and that is institutional design that is more likely to work when the rule of law is already strong. The regulators are already strong. So I was hoping to create a framework that was more amenable to different kinds of legal contexts. And then very briefly on policy mixes, I agree. In fact, on India, with the Climate Policy Lab, the work that we do in India emphasizes the mix of policies rather than what we call silver bullet policies, that, okay, one policy will solve everything. Carbon pricing will solve everything. That in our opinion is a wrong view, because we emphasize the importance of a mix of policies, demand and supply policies. What I'm trying to do with this paper, I don't know yet whether it has come across, is to suggest that there is a similar logic with institutions, that the mix of institutions and the interaction between institutions is more important than the strength of one particular institution or one particular type of institution. But of course, whether that has fully come across is an open question, but that's what I'm trying to emphasize, the importance of institutional mix through this paper.
Thank you, Tarun. Jorge, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. You have some very interesting evidence for the academy in the text that I think is worth exploring further. For example, through the use of Christopher Hood's typology, that is always good bring in the classics, right? It is clear to the British model of law, or act was overwhelmed by the differences in the laws you select. In my point of view, they both exhibit different institutional cultures from each other and are adaptive policies. That is, policy transfer did not occur as a simple copy-paste or copy and paste. What do you say about this?
If I understand you correctly, you're saying that Hood's typology of the tools of government is itself a classification that is very specific to one particular context, and you're saying maybe it's not useful in different contexts, or
No, the use of typology show us the difference between the climate change acts and show us the different institutional cultures of the different cultural institution of the different countries.
Absolutely. I think that's completely true. The balance of institutions in different countries is different. And I think that should be expected and it's natural. And it's not a problem, except if the type of one particular institution is near zero, in my opinion. And of course, it is subjective what is near zero. Some people might say 15% is near zero. For my own calculation, under 10% is where you say, okay, maybe there is a missing institution problem here. But beyond that, I think that's exactly right. I wanted to use this framework as a way of saying differences between the institutional mix in different countries are not in themselves a problem unless there is a complete lack of one kind of institution. And for that, of course, part of the justification there is, okay, these four categories are not just category, they're almost like food groups. Like you need some amount of vitamin, some amount of carbohydrate. It's that kind of sort of approach that I'm bringing here. It's okay to have a little bit less of one, a little bit more of one, but if anything is near zero, then it's a problem.
Thank you, Tarun.
Thank you very much, Tarun. I have to say before beginning, I'm also a little bit sick today, and also I have a sort of advantage because it's the third time we discuss this paper, so I'm a little bit more into it. So I would like to start probably with Jorge's comments because I think that's really important to understand that the target of our project precisely is to understand how policy diffusion has worked across the region in Latin America, specifically focused in Chile, Colombia, and Mexico, and how far actually when they were designing the policy, they adopt some or they adapt to the national institutional cultures some aspects that there were more specific of Mexico, for example, right? And I think that what we can start saying is that there was not actual an institutional adaptation, but more a copy paste, Jorge. I mean, and we need to collect more interviews and more discussion, but at least the first generation of climate acts in Latin America or in other countries were sort of copy paste. And also, I mean, I think that your paper, part of the idea is to construct a collaboration between groups, and I think that your paper, as I've said before, could be really enriched with a mix of methods. That it's something that Ceci was already asking, Laura. Like, how did you choose that? Like, probably to have a more in-depth analysis of some of the cases of to understand the institutional links and all that, right? And I really think that you could work with Jorge because he's really good with QCA,
Okay.
and you can actually cross the data to present that in in a more quantified way, right?
Mhm.
And I have just, I think it's a couple of comments, and I really would like, it's more like think out loud with you and the group. I
Okay.
was very interested when you present the different types of institutions per country. Like, for example, when you refer to power and you refer to the specific targets, I think probably because we are from Latin America and we have always this north-south divide bias, but there is a clear division between those developed countries that have specific targets and those who not. For example, Mexico in the middle, but there is a bridge between one and another, right? And speaking also about this, like I was thinking while you were presenting, it's really interesting that those countries most frequently underdeveloped countries that they kind of bet for governance or for coordination, they do not have regulatory institutions. And those who have regulatory institutions that are mainly European or from the global north, they do not have coordination mechanisms. And I really think that this finding that you have, and I think that you do not highlight as you could, as you should, is something really interesting to reflect this institutional adaptation concerning climate acts in different regions in Latin America, and that for us, for example, with Ceci and Juan, thinking about Latin America, it's really interesting that our regulatory aspect it's really weak, but then we bet for strong coordination mechanisms. And this will be my last point in order to open the discussion. But I really think that, as we have seen in Chile with some interviews or in Mexico, the preference of coordination mechanism over regulatory mechanism is that they are more the regulated actors are more comfortable and it's easier to adopt this sort of policies, right? So I don't know if Ceci would like to jump in this discussion, but of course, because in Chile, the private actors were in favor of the climate policy because there is no regulation at all. I mean, there is a mandatory something to just to coordinate, but come on. And also that's why environmentalists were not really optimistic about framework law in Chile. So I'm just thinking out loud, but I really enjoy having this conversation with you, Tarun.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, this point, I don't think we discussed the last time. The fact that there's more coordination in developing and more regulatory in developed countries, but you did make the point that this preference for coordination is actually a weakness because it's not actually a strong law. So let me ask you this, and you mentioned, I think Cecilia and others. You also have made the point before to me and maybe elsewhere that like it is useful to talk in terms of governance, that the role of these framework laws is supposed to set up governance. So by governance, you mean regulation or do you mean different kinds of institutions?
Do you want to answer, Ceci?
Yeah. I think what one takeaway of what you present is that we should talk about institutions rather than governance because it dilutes the what is being enforced and what is the law doing. When we're talking about the law, which is what we're talking now, is
Right.
I think it's stronger to show how the law reshapes or transform the institutions, the institutionality, the rules under which governance as part of governance. But expanding on what Isra said, you know, when you at the beginning when you show how this thing of having responsibles in institutionally, you said it could be private sector, it could be only the state, but these laws that have this all this, I agree with you that the focus on links can be a weakness, but also the private sector doesn't have any responsibility in the law. It's only so you see then there is a responsible, but it's only one who cannot do much because the emissions are
You
not
mean the government is you're saying the government is made responsible and it can't do all that much. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, I think fair. Yeah, I mean there are. I think that's true in Mexico's law that there are a lot more responsibilities placed on the government rather than the private sector. It was interesting to me that in some laws the responsibility was placed more directly on the private sector. In Kenya's law, for example, which I thought was also a kind of well drafted law. But in Mexico's law, for example, the language that talked about the government's role, I interpreted it as giving the government powers to regulate. But of course, Israel is saying, and others are saying, just because the law gives the government the power to regulate, it doesn't mean the government actually acts on that power. because there is still political opposition, and there are many more things that need to happen before the government actually acts on that power, which is a fair point. My little bit of surprise is if a law says that a government should regulate some industry, and the government doesn't regulate that industry, in principle, it is possible for a citizen to go to the court and say, well, the government is acting contrary to the law. This happens sometimes in India, for example. And of course, the record of whether that kind of litigation is successful or not is mixed. This is a fact we all live with. But I was curious whether that kind of litigation happens based on this law in Mexico or in the countries that have such laws. I didn't look at it in detail, but at the end of the paper, I do note that what we know of litigation, climate litigation, is very focused on human rights and the constitution in many countries. It's not really focused on, okay, well, if a law tells the government to do something and the government hasn't done it, then the court may instruct the government to do its duty under the existing law. I wonder if one, there are those kinds of cases. Two, if there are not, why there are not, and three, whether maybe in the future those kinds of cases might become more common.
I would
think
like to jump in.
yeah.
Sorry, Ceci, come on.
No, that was one of the panels in this seminar of the superior institution. That's their job. And also they have a panel
Right.
on climate litigation, and they discuss exactly what you just said, that so far litigation has been more on human rights, etc. But once you have a law, then they could go into even kind of taking the audits that these superior institutions do,
Right.
and
Right.
and doing climate doing litigation against the government. But that's only starting.
Right. In my opinion, potentially very powerful. But yes, yeah, that's very interesting to hear. Yeah. Sorry, Israel, you were about to.
Yes, I mean, I have just from the previous point, I am more a governance guy, and it's because I was in Europe during the 2000s, and I was in all this new governance stuff and discussion, and I really think that these climate acts phenomenon actually give us enough material to discuss the new forms of governance that climate action is taking. That's why I'm a little bit enjoying this. I'm enjoying this discussion because to me it's not so about instruments but about the styles of governance, and it was a strong discussion 20 years ago, but as many environmental issues come back and forth once and again, right?
Yeah.
Institutions are the structures where governance takes place. So it's just that the laws are not governance.
Yeah, no, I agree, but we cannot, returning to Jorge's point, we cannot understand institutions without in within the governance framework, and Juan also said that, without the political and institutional culture. And I think that this is part of the missing link, I will of the paper, right? Like it's hard to I mean, it's important to have the comparative between 10 climate acts from across the world, but of course it's difficult to get into this political and institutional culture. And just to keep the case of Mexico, I've just written a paper on the Tren Maya in southern Mexico, and the president role, and also I think I will be banned in Mexico after it's published, but whatever. So actually, civil society acted against the construction of the Tren Maya because of missing environmental impact assessments. And an institution that was called INAI, in order to promote transparency in governmental sectors, acted, and it's called an constitutional challenge, right, against the government because he was missing environmental impact assessments, and the court actually gave the reason to INAI. Hours after that, Andrés Manuel López Obrador issued a new decree with the same content to continue the construction of the Tren Maya because of security matters. And now with Claudia Sheinbaum, like 12 months after that, we do not have an eye, and we're about to vote for electing judges in Mexico. So that, for me, it's like the whole case about how the institutional culture and the political structure affects all these laws. So we have not dismantled the laws. For example, the climate fund. It was not because they were against the climate fund. It was they wanted to have the control over the resources. And it's not that they are acting against climate action. They are acting against this neoliberal governance form that took climate action before in climate action. That's my reading. I think it's a little bit hard, or I don't know Jorge's his point, but that's my reading. It's all about politics in Mexico. I don't know about Chile, Colombia, but that's my reading on this. My take, Tarun.
That I broadly agree with that. My question would be like when you say that they're not against climate action, they just want control over that resource. It was still interesting to me, like when you create institutions, we know this idea of institutional capture, regulatory capture. Like that's a well-known, and to me, it's once you create an institution. It is not inevitable that that institution remains free from political influence. So I'm never looking at an institution that is created by a law and saying, well, if it doesn't work exactly the way I want it to or I expect it to, then it's a bad institution. But I'm still surprised when an institution is created by a law and then it is dismantled by government after the creation of the law. Because that's not capture to my mind. But again, people may disagree. That's dismantling. And that's an interesting choice. It's like if you're the government, if you're elected, what is it, a 6-year term, I believe? Your power to
Yes,
make
six
all
terms, six
yeah,
years.
like even so the law says you have to allocate money to climate priorities. That doesn't mean you can't allocate money to your own political allies. The companies that are set up as renewable energy companies can be your own political allies in principle. That's not moral, it's not good governance, but it can happen. It's more interesting when you say, well, the law tells me I need to allocate money towards climate priorities. I'm not allocating that money. That's an interesting one to me because that really indicates that the laws have even less effect than one would assume. They do not constrain action at all.
Yeah, agree. Ceci, do you want to jump in? Jorge?
No, absolutely agree. I absolutely agree that the summary is institutional constraints and policy.
Right.
I
Yeah.
think Nirvana has one last question, and we'll leave you to rest, Tarun, please. Thank you very much for your strong courage in presenting.
Again, this is great for me. So thank you to you all. But Nirvana, as you mentioned.
Yeah, but it's in the same way to the discussion, so they already answered. So thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I think, well, we can now close the transmission, actually the recording of this. And thank you very much, Tarun. I think we all learned a lot from your presentation. And part of the purpose of this meeting was also to establish some links between researchers. So I don't want if you want to start with your uh, throwing the ball and tell what. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, my hope for is sort of the things that I want to continue talking to you, this group about are twofold. Number one, Israel, I think, is already mentioned, and maybe it's useful for me to be more explicit. I want to start talking to people who are familiar with the operation of laws in these countries, climate laws in these countries, and gain more of a sense of the national context. So far, my sense of national context has been shaped by literature review rather than interviews, and I think it's probably a useful thing to start adding some more richer context and experience to that. So I, I'm very glad to have a bunch of you here who have been working on these issues, and I'll reach out to maybe set up a time to talk down somewhere in the coming weeks. The sort of maybe little bigger picture. I don't know whether this is what you were referring to, Israel, but it's on my mind, so I'll say it. Is that as a lot of you have mentioned, I think there is something to be said for this idea of national climate legal systems. I think there is other work about national innovation systems or national energy innovation systems, other kinds of systems. But I think this idea of a national climate governance system where there are different kinds of institutions and they interact with each other, and kind of useful comparisons about what kind of interaction are more effective, less effective. I think that's an idea that I am personally interested in pursuing. So I'm hoping to pitch that as maybe a broader project to people within my own center, the Climate Policy Lab, at the Fletcher School, something that can happen over the next 2 years or 3 years. And that will be something that's structured around national case studies. So at my center, the Climate Policy Lab, we already have a project that goes country by country, particularly developing countries, on climate policy. We have these climate policy inventories that are up online. Maybe I'll share a link with Israel at some point. I want to do something similar with climate governance institutions and climate legislation. And I would love to talk to you more about maybe how to collaborate on that in the coming months, coming years. So that's what's on my mind, Israel.
Great, thank you very much, Tarun. I don't know if you have something in your mind, Ceci, Juan, that you want to pitch right now.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, many thanks. I'm just think that we will have to work better this relationship between institutions and governance, because it's a powerful way of going into it. And I just many things, like thinking how many times in a law the private sector is mentioned. So it may be no, and then in the classification you are doing now, still it will be like there are responsibles, but who is the responsible is not a minor thing if we think on the on a governance, from a governance point of view. Yeah,
Absolutely.
but so many questions and things to keep looking.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, the next session of the webinar will be with Polar Moragas from Chile. So it would be great if you could connect, Tarun, so because you will further understand the discussions on Latin America. And as I told you, my part of our idea is to prepare the book proposal for the manuscript on climate acts in Latin America. And I would love if you could write, probably with the help and support of some of our young researchers here, to create something on Latin America, like a similar study, and more descriptive on what institutions are present. And I think that this could be a magnificent contribution for the edited book that we're collecting. And of course, thank you very much. I think we have learned a lot, and I will share your contact in the WhatsApp group that we have. So probably you will receive several emails with different sort of asking you to collaborate or to participate in something. But I'm sure that you will be happy to make this contact with Latin America.
Very, very happy. I would love it.
Great. Well, thank you all.